Welcome to Fresh Outlook on this last weekend in February. I'm Mia Toski. Lots of folks are ready to say goodbye to this long winter. Here in New Jersey, where we tape the show, we've had record snowfalls this year. We hope wherever you are, it's beginning to thaw out. Now, we have a busy show today. We're going to start things off in Ukraine. While much of the world is watching the Olympics, all eyes are also turning to the Ukraine. Downtown Kiev looks to be in the hands of the opposition after President Viktor Yanukovych made huge concessions to protesters and then left the city. Let's have a look at the latest news and talk it out.
As anti-government protesters kept up their presence in Independence Square, there's word that an all-night negotiating session between European mediators, Ukraine's president, and the opposition will bring about early elections in an attempt to end the ongoing political crisis.
They help. It's good. It was necessary to do this earlier. It's a big win for us.
Also Friday, fighting broke out between deputies in Ukraine's parliament when the speaker declared a pause, delaying a debate on a possible resolution calling for the president's powers to be reduced. And panic is spreading to eastern Ukraine, where very long lines are developing at cash machines following violence in the capital, Kiev.
I saw everybody was withdrawing, so I'm withdrawing too.
In western Ukraine, a small-town police chief defected along with his unit.
How are we supposed to look on if they're shooting at a peaceful population? How are we to look on calmly when we gave our vows to protect the Ukrainian people and not some bunch of oligarchs?
They traveled to Kiev and joined protesters in Independence Square.
And to talk more about the situation and Parliament's decision to impeach the president, we are joined by former White House aide Didi Benke, Dr. Michael McCoy from Rutgers University, Sebastian Aulich, and in our Washington, D.C. studios, Dr. Alan Topol, national best-selling author of 6 novels, including The Russian Endgame. We welcome you all to the show, and thank you. And Sebastian, I also want to mention that you're an attorney and you worked with the Polish government as well.
That's correct. I actually work for the Polish government here in New York City at the Polish Consulate General.
And obviously this situation is going to be, a lot of the Polish citizens as well are very concerned about this. But first I want to start with Dr. McCoy. We've talked about the Ukraine before. If you can just touch on the brief history of how this violence began.
Well, really it began, well first in terms of actual events, the real major spark was the decision by President Yanukovych to not support a treaty with the European Union and rather to accept $15 billion in aid from Russia instead, which looked like a bribe to pull away from the European Union. But more broadly, we're looking at more systemic things about the division in Ukraine between the more sort of nationalist Ukrainian West versus the more Russified Russian favoring East.
And I do want to talk about that. Alan, down in D.C., we want to talk about the East and West and what the difference is. Can you just share some of your insights on that? I know you've studied Russian politics for quite some time.
Sure, I did a lot in connection with my book, The Russian Endgame, but the difference is in the eastern Ukraine, Russia is the language that's mainly spoken, strong support for Russia. It's the area in which the president has come from. Western Ukraine, much a different story. I mean, there, Russian is not the language. There's much more of an outreach toward Western Europe. And therein lies the germs of the conflict which has now developed, this split in the country. And Yanukovych, coming from the east, has the support there. And it's not surprising that when he left Kiev, he traveled east. But that's the dichotomy within the country, basically almost 2 different countries.
And of course, the latest news, Yanukovych said he would not resign or leave the country. He also called the decisions by Parliament illegal. A quote from him: "The events witnessed by our country and the whole world are an example of a coup," he said, comparing it to the rise of the Nazis to power in Germany in the 1930s. Sebastian, we were talking about that earlier. What do you think? You think Yanukovych is going to go into Russia? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's very hard to predict what's going to happen right now because the situation is changing so fast. But what we see right now is the restitution of the 2004 Constitution, which limits the power of the president. We now saw this morning actually that Yanukovych was impeached by the parliament. And also the former Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko was released from prison when she went to the Independence Square and declared that she's going to run for the president in the May 25th elections.
I was just going to bring up those May 25th elections. Didi, obviously this is a huge nightmare right now for Putin. Just your thoughts on that.
You know, maybe I should feel guilty for the smile on my face, but I don't. Because, you know, I think Putin, and I agree with McCain, and I agree with a lot of the Republicans, that the president has been so naive about Putin. Putin is a bad, ruthless, terrible leader. He has not been good, and I'm glad the Olympics really have shown his true colors. And he has supported this country. He has supported this guy. This is his puppet. He should be out. This guy, basically Putin running it. So, you know, all this happening, good for this country, and hopefully they can have a good leadership and get this guy out of there.
Well, I want to talk about what role, you know, you bring up our president as well, Didi. I want everyone to answer and think about this. What role should the U.S. play? And we'll weigh in on that question with you, Alan, in Washington, D.C.
Sure. First of all, let me say I strongly agree with Didi. This is all about Putin. I mean, Putin's running the show, and Yanukovych is operating as his puppet. And Putin plays to win. He doesn't play to lose. And so this agreement, this so-called agreement, has to be viewed as something very temporary and transitory to let Yanukovych recoup and get together under the guidance of Putin. They will continue to fight. This is far from over. As far as the United States, this is starting to resemble Hungary in 1956 all over again, which is a pretty discomforting thought, where the United States makes grandiose statements, but we're not going to do anything. We're not going to intervene in any way. And so unfortunately, it's the people on the ground who are going to be in the line of fire, because that's the way this thing's going to evolve. And Didi's absolutely right. It is about Putin. He plays to win, and he will not quit after this round.
And of course, President Obama really didn't do anything in Syria, and now we're seeing something like that happening again.
Well, other than let Putin take over the reins, and, you know, and seriously, our president should have done something with that, and he just hands it over to Putin. It was a big joke. It made us look like a joke.
Dr. McCoy?
You know,
actually...
well, go ahead.
Go on, Alan.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, it's good you brought up Syria, because that so-called agreement in Syria, let's reflect on that for a minute. That agreement to disassemble the nuclear arms has not been implemented. And so what happened, there was a crisis. Obama threatened to act. Assad, backed by Putin, said, no, we'll back off. We'll make an agreement. Go away. Don't do anything. Obama said, fine. And now it's 6 months later. The arms haven't been removed, and Assad's still in power. And it's the same thing in Ukraine. Their idea of an agreement is just a way to get some time.
That's an excellent point. Thank you, Alan. Let's go back. I want to go also.
I actually would. I mean, I would separate Ukraine from Syria. I mean, Syria is a very serious civil war where now hundreds of thousands of people have either been killed or displaced. In Ukraine, a very serious political crisis, but not one where there's been a terrible loss of life. 70 people have died in Kiev. But it's not a situation where I think there's a need for U.S. Military active intervention. I think U.S. policy here has actually been pretty good, been subtly supportive of the protesters, not trying to make this an East-West crisis, really putting focus on a support for democracy. And I think the role for now for the U.S. is to support this move by Parliament to reestablish a democratic government.
Sebastian, do you agree with that this isn't an East-West issue?
On the geopolitical side, I believe it is East versus West. Now, since you brought up President Obama, let me just tell you this, that Ukraine was one of the first post-Soviet republics to join Bill Clinton's Partnership for Peace initiative. They sent troops to Iraq, they sent troops to Afghanistan, they provided military bases for NATO cargo to Afghanistan, and they possess some, very advanced defense weapons that, a lot of terrorists will be happy to put their hands on. So I just believe that Ukraine deserves a little bit more than just a phone call from Joe Biden. That's pretty much my stance about this. The U.S. doesn't have to send any kind of troops or anything else. Like we saw with the foreign ministers of Poland, Germany, and France, there's a lot to be done with diplomacy, and that diplomacy can be actually effective. So I believe if the U.S. has so many tools in its arsenal, diplomatic arsenal, that it can use to help, to calm down the situation, to dissolve the tension, and help move the country forward. And
how worried are the folks, obviously you're Polish, how worried are the folks over in Poland that this could spread?
Well, we are extremely worried because, like I said, when you look at what's happening on the ground, it's obviously economy and so on, but when you look at it from a geopolitical perspective, It's pretty much Russia versus the European Union. So it is a geopolitical crisis at one level. And we are worried that the United States is not so involved in the region. It wants to pivot to, to Asia with its foreign policy. But how are you going to do it if you have Ukraine, which is pretty much could be a fallen country, falling apart?
Well, it absolutely is falling apart when you see people on those cash machines. I mean, just the visuals of those people taking their money out of the banks.
But I think it's actually been a good thing that we've seen some of the other European countries, such as French Foreign Ministry, German Foreign Ministry, take a lead role in this instead of the United States, because it can't be the United States taking the lead role in everything around the world. There are very adept other countries around the world who can take a leadership role that the United States can support, and it's been a good thing to see our allies in Europe taking a position in this, because most countries, I actually believe our policy in Syria has been awful. I think it's been an awful policy in Syria. But in a situation like Ukraine, where it's less of a military confrontation, where the United States is only with the military hardware to pull things off, it's good to see our allies step up and us support them. And we've already seen a now strong democratic outcome with Yanukovych actually stepping down.
So hopefully
this
it's ridiculous. Across the board. No. Obama,
this was the first Winter Olympics where not even a major delegation from the president's cabinet or White House was sent.
That's how clearly this was a rebuke. But say something about Ukraine. Take leadership.
What I'm saying about Ukraine, and what we're seeing about Ukraine is we actually saw Yanukovych step down without the type of dissension that we're seeing in Syria. So I think so far the way it's been managed by our European allies has been quite good.
Let's talk about support for a second. A lot of people may argue that Ukraine's economy is actually worse off than Greece's. Is it possible that they're going to default on some of their international obligations? Alan, we'll ask you that first question, and then we're going to go to Sebastian.
Sure. I think the economy is very, very much at risk, and that's where Putin says he has to come in and bail out the country. And so the question I'd like to ask everybody, which is the hard question where rubber hits the road, what happens if Putin says, Yevtushenko asked me to send in troops, so I'm sending in Russian troops at his request to help him restore order in Kiev? What do we do then? That's sort of the nightmare scenario, and you can't say it couldn't happen, because with Putin it clearly could happen, and I think Didi will agree with me it could happen. Won't you, Didi?
I do. I'm in total agreement with you. You're exactly right.
But this is also a nightmare for Putin as well.
Yeah, Putin could do that, but that would completely isolate. Think about this is an economy that's completely or very heavily dependent on oil revenue. Which means that he's therefore depending on international sales. If he does this, and this leads to a complete backlash from both the EU and the United States, that could plunge the Russian economy into it. So we shouldn't just think of Putin as a completely, omnipotent, isolated player who can do all these big things. He has things that he's vulnerable in a lot of important areas too.
And I understand Alan's point as well, but do you think, the repercussions, obviously, if they can't, if they default on their international obligations, that's going to have a trickle effect around the world.
This is actually very probable danger what's going to happen. Ukraine has $60 billion in cash reserves, when at the same time it owes $30 billion to Russia at this point. It has to buy back governmental bonds by June in the amount of $5 billion. The bond yield is right now 35%, it's pretty much at the default level. So at one point, within a couple of months, we are going to see that this economy is just going to fall apart. And I think this is also one, since we are discussing what the United States could do, I believe it's sort of like a Marshall Plan. The equivalent of the Marshall Plan for Ukraine would be something really good.
Yeah, I think you're right. Because look, I think many people agree in the world that Putin is a bad guy. Over and over again, we keep seeing this. And at the Olympics was a big black eye. Not for the athletes, but for Putin, with his reaction and the way he's acted and the way he's been against gays and he's just been a very bad leader for the world. And everyone thinks Sochi was a mistake because of him. So you know what? I like the Marshall Plan. That means you have a team effort against Putin.
Well, we're definitely going to be talking about this subject in the weeks and months to come, I'm sure. Sebastian, we want to thank you very much for coming in. Editor-in-Chief of the European Courier, thank you so much for being here. And don't go away, everyone. When we come back, we're going to switch gears a bit and talk about the Craigslist alleged murderer and the rise in violence amongst teens.